Maelle's character arc in Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is both a hero's journey and a coming-of-age story. A hero's journey, broadly speaking, involves a protagonist leaving the ordinary world, facing trials in some form of special world, undergoing a transformation there, and then returning home changed. Technically, this is a nesting doll situation where Maelle undergoes a hero's journey inside of another hero's journey. On one level, Maelle leaves the ordinary world of Lumiere, travels through the special world of the Shattered Continent, transforms when she learns her true identity, and then returns to Lumiere as a paintress. On another level, Alicia leaves the real world to enter the special world of the canvas, lives a whole other life as Maelle, and in the end transforms by merging her two identities. But this is where her story gets interesting, because depending on which ending you choose, the return home may never happen. If she remains inside the canvas, then this layer of the journey is never completed. But that is only one half of the narrative. A coming-of-age story involves a young person's transition from childhood to adulthood. I am going to list off some of its common tropes, and as I go through this list, I bet you will already notice some similarities to Maelle's character arc. 1. An adventure. Our character has to leave the safety and familiarity of home behind and venture out into the wider world. 2. An encounter with death, which forces our young protagonist to come to terms with mortality. 3. A mentor figure, an older and more experienced person who shows our protagonist the ropes, how to survive in a dangerous world. Often, this mentor figure will exit the narrative around the midway point, forcing our protagonist to use what they have learned to survive on their own. 4. A conflict with a parental figure. Coming-of-age stories often involve children trying to establish a separate identity from their parents. 5. The loss of innocence. Children are often portrayed as naive and trusting, but an encounter with cruelty, betrayal, or the darker side of human nature strips away their childish sensibilities and forces them to confront the world's harsher truths. And finally, 6. Self-discovery. By the end of the journey, the protagonist will learn something about themselves and their place in the world. There will be a noticeable transformation, personal growth, or change in perspective, and this is often represented by a change in physical appearance. Just like with the hero's journey, depending on which ending you choose, Maelle may never actually grow up. She can become trapped in a Peter Pan-esque Never Never Land. In fact, her story is not just put on hold, but I think it actually regresses. In some ways, she is more of a child at the end than she was at the beginning. Okay, before I delve further, I want to compare Maelle's character with that of her mother. They are very similar in some ways. Both of them become attached or even addicted to the canvas and refuse to leave. In the end, they both have to be violently forced out by a family member for their own safety, and actually the same family member. It is Verso who wields the knife both times, but their motivations for staying are slightly different. Aline's story is all about grief and escapism. In my previous videos, I spent a lot of time discussing the theme of grief, how corrosive it is, how it shatters the Dissandra family, and leads them down these self-destructive paths. Aline is incapable of facing the reality of her son's death. She chooses to escape inside the canvas instead, to live out a fantasy where he never died in the first place. But Maelle's attachment to the canvas is somewhat different. She is escaping too, but instead of trying to escape from grief, she is escaping from guilt and loneliness. Let's start with guilt. Maelle feels responsible for the death of her brother, and not just that, but for the way his death has shattered her entire family. In my video on Renoir, we discussed how part of the reason he is so desperate to save his remaining family members is to make up for his failure to save his son's life. And I think Maelle is doing something similar. By rescuing the canvas from her father, not only does she escape from guilt in this happy fantasy world, but she even gets to feel like a savior, like she is the hero. Whereas out in the harsh real world, she feels like she will never be anything more than that foolish little kid who ruined everything by getting her brother killed. And more than that, she is even able to save a version of him here. She can give this Verso the long, happy life she feels like she stole from the real one, which is complicated by the fact that this Verso does not want that life. He refuses to willingly participate in her fantasy, which spoils the entire project. Next, let's talk about loneliness. At the start of the story, Maelle is a character who is portrayed again and again as someone who does not fit in. Then, over the course of her journey with Expedition 33, she grows closer to the other expeditioners. She builds a patchwork family of misfits and oddballs, and for the first time in her life, she feels like she has finally found somewhere she truly belongs. But the tragic twist is that as soon as she finds this new family, she is told that she must abandon it. The canvas is not her true home. She will die if she stays here. This is why both her hero's journey and her coming-of-age arc are halted or even inverted, as she cannot stand the guilt and loneliness that await her in the real world beyond the canvas. If you choose Verso's ending, the last shot is of Alicia standing all by herself, her family having already drifted away, her painted friends faded into non-existence. She stands alone, facing an uncertain future. But that is kind of the definition of adulthood. That is a reality we all have to confront eventually. Alright, that was the overview, now let's get into specifics. What I want to do now is follow Maelle's story from beginning to end and examine where each of these themes appear in her story. Maelle shows up in basically every single scene of the game, so we're gonna try to do this quickly, speed round. Scene 1, in the opening, the day of the Gommage. Maelle and Gustave share some playful yet poignant banter in the opening. This is the most important relationship in Maelle's life up to this point, and the writing here emphasizes the easy intimacy of their friendship, as well as how much she cares about him, encouraging him to say goodbye to his beloved Sophie before it is too late. She is also already being portrayed as a character in isolation in this first scene. While the rest of Lumiere holds a farewell festival for those about to die, she keeps her distance, saying she does not understand why the city celebrates the Gommage. Later, in a camp conversation with Verso, she will say that she was an orphan. Her parents gommaged when she was very young, and she even suspects that they did not really want her, which is not true, but doesn't matter here. After their deaths, she bounced from foster family to foster family, never finding a place to call home. She describes herself as a weird kid who did not get along easily with others. Scene 2, the Gommage. While Sophie fades away, Maelle is shown holding the hands of these two children. These are kids who have just been orphaned by the deaths of their parents. And Maelle, being an orphan herself and knowing how hard this is for them, has volunteered to guide them through the next steps. Here she is portrayed as empathetic and caring, helping in what little ways she can, the kind of character it is easy to root for. Scene 3, the going away party. Maelle is portrayed very literally as a character set apart from the rest, standing by herself at the end of the dock. When Gustave comes out to speak with her, she explicitly says that Lumiere is not her home. She feels that she does not have any friends or family here who really care about her. Usually in this setting, people only set off on expeditions during the last year of life before the Gommage. But Maelle is different. She still has another 9 years left. The rest of the expeditioners are very focused on defeating the Paintress and saving their home. But Maelle's motivations are a bit different. Partly, she is leaving now because Gustave is the only thing she has that resembles a family, and she cannot bear to be apart from him. And partly because she is miserable here, and in typical brooding teenage fashion, she wants to run away. She would rather die out there than spend another day living in Lumiere. This is a character who is deeply unhappy, searching for a family or for a place where she feels like she truly belongs. Scene 4, Expedition 33 sets off on their quest in high spirits. This is the first element of both the coming-of-age story and the hero's journey, leaving home or the ordinary world behind. Something important to understand about these kinds of narrative journeys is that they are usually layered. There is a big, obvious goal on the surface and then something more subtle occurring underneath, an internal journey that mirrors the external one. It is not uncommon for characters to actually fail the big, obvious goal, and then in the end it will be revealed that the subtler internal quest was the only one that really mattered. The big, obvious goal in Clair Obscur is the quest to save their home, which is only partially achieved. Expedition 33 do slay their arch-nemesis, the Paintress, but in doing so they unwittingly doom the city of Lumiere and all of its inhabitants. The less obvious internal journey belongs to Maelle, her search for identity, meaning, and belonging, which is also only partially successful. She does rediscover her past and find a new home, But that past is full of painful memories she would rather have forgotten, and her home turns out to be poisonous to her. Scene 5, Maelle has a pretty immediate encounter with death here, another of our coming-of-age story elements, when nearly the entire expedition is slaughtered as soon as they set foot on the beach. She then disappears from the narrative for a period of time and the focus shifts towards Gustave, who is portrayed to be utterly devoted to his adopted sister. He is willing to abandon the entire expedition to ensure her safety, and is only persuaded otherwise by the ever-practical and implacable Lune. Scene 6, Maelle and Gustave are reunited inside the mysterious manor. I love this scene, the way it shows how deeply these two care about each other. It is somewhat ironic that Maelle spends her whole story looking for a family, when it is obvious that she already had one from the very beginning. But there is something else going on here too. While the rest of the expedition was slaughtered on the beach, Maelle alone was transported to safety and left in the care of this ominous humanoid creature, the Curator. The writers are communicating to the audience that there is something different about Maelle. There is some mystery here waiting to be unpackaged. Scene 7, the encounter with the Rose Nevron, an unusually peaceful Nevron which appears to be concerned only with protecting its flower garden. There is this absolutely beautiful shot of Maelle reaching out towards the Nevron, and afterwards she says that it felt familiar somehow. She feels some connection with this strange alien creature in a way she never did with the people back in Lumiere. And it is significant that Gustave is the one who abruptly breaks that potential connection by attacking the Nevron. Gustave, though he does truly love her, is actually holding her back. She will not be able to fulfill her true potential until he is gone. And in this way he fits the archetypal role of the mentor. There is also a sense of wonder being explored here. Maelle is excited to be exploring an unfamiliar world full of mystery and beauty. She is shown to be far happier here than she ever was in Lumiere. And with the benefit of hindsight, we know that the things she is falling in love with are actually the creations of her own siblings, the world Verso and Clea built. It is as if she is rediscovering her own family and her love for them for the first time. It's really sweet. Scene 8. Back in the camp, Maelle has a nightmare in which we see flames, a shot of Verso standing over the corpse of Gustave, and Maelle screaming in fury. You will not understand these images the first time you see them, but there is a sense of foreboding. There is worse yet to come for Expedition 33. This is followed by a conversation between Maelle and Gustave, and this is the first scene in which she is shown struggling to come to terms with mortality. She says, "Death out here is not like death in Lumiere, is it? I thought I was used to losing people, but not like that." What she is getting at here is that back in Lumiere, the Gommage is ritualized. It comes on schedule, which makes it easier to handle. But out in the wider world, she is discovering that death is violent, unexpected, and sudden, and she does not know how to deal with that yet. Gustave's advice is to run away from death, and this is well intended, but I think ultimately harmful. Running away from death, choosing escapism, is exactly what is destroying her mother, and what could eventually destroy her too. Maelle needs to learn how to face not only death, but all of those difficult feelings, guilt, loneliness, regret, without turning away. Scene 9. I am going to group all of the Gestral scenes together. There is a dramatic tonal change in the narrative during this section, where before the story was bleak and terrible and full of death and suffering, with the introduction of the Gestrals it becomes silly, goofy, and playful. This is an important change because the writers need Maelle to enjoy her journey out here. There needs to be a reason why she would choose the canvas over the real world. It needs to be light and happy and fun. It is also notable that Maelle takes point in negotiating with the Gestrals. Where the stuffy adults Gustave and Lune fail, the more childish Maelle is the one who succeeds in convincing the Gestrals to welcome the expedition into their village. At one point, Gustave even says, "You're better with the Gestrals than you are with humans." Scene 10. Back in camp after reuniting with Ciel, the world suddenly turns grayscale, the aspect ratio changes, and the other characters freeze as Maelle alone is confronted by a mysterious masked figure. A key theme of the coming-of-age story is self-discovery, identity, a young person figuring out who they really are and who they want to become. In this scene, Maelle is literally being confronted by herself, her own reflection, and it is notable that at this point, and for most of the story, she is incapable of recognizing herself. What better metaphor for a lack of self-knowledge could there be? I think that Painted Alicia represents Maelle's past, her scars, her mistakes, her guilt, all of these things she is currently unable to reconcile with. After she regains her true identity and reclaims her past, this second self will become obsolete and be dissolved into non-existence. This also plays into the theme of alienation. Maelle's visions of her other self and of Painted Renoir cause her to feel isolated from the other expeditioners. Later on, in a conversation with Gustave, this is how she describes the experience.
I don't understand what's happening, and I feel like I never understood. Like, I'm always missing something that everyone else just gets. In Lumiere, life never made sense, and I never fit, and now out here, when it was just starting to maybe feel good, then this happens, and...
Yeah. I hate it too. Things we don't understand. They just make us feel small and powerless. But it helps, you know, to focus on the things I do understand, on the people I care about and who care about me. And, you know, now I feel a little less lost, because at least we're lost together.
And goddamn, how can you people say that Gustave is any less real than her when the feelings he expresses are so genuine and so raw, and he's just such a nice guy? The advice he gives here is fantastic. When you feel lost or powerless, focus on what you do understand, what you can control. It's great. But I'm getting sidetracked. Two things to note here. First, the way Maelle's describing her emotions in this scene is really typical of people who don't fit in easily with others. Like, is there something wrong with me? Is there something missing inside of me that everyone else possesses? You might assume that the reason why Maelle feels so out of place in Lumiere is because she actually does not belong here. She is not just imagining things. She really is fundamentally different from everyone else. She is a real person from the real world, while they are, well, I do not think it is accurate to describe them as artificial exactly, but they are born of the canvas, inhabitants of a totally different reality. However, as we will see later, Maelle did not fit in back home in the real world either. This is a character trait that extends to both of her identities. Second, notice the way Gustave acts as a kind of emotional grounding force in Maelle's life. When she is at risk of getting lost in her own feelings, he pulls her back down to earth. When he is gone, we will see her emotions begin to spiral out of control. Scene 11, the murder of Gustave. This is another encounter with death, and this one hits Maelle much harder. Whereas the slaughter of the other expeditioners was merely upsetting, this one is going to radically change her entire life. The only family she ever had is gone. However, Painted Renoir says that this is a kindness, not a cruelty, and from a metatextual perspective, he is correct. This is necessary for her growth. She needs to leave the metaphorical nest behind. As long as she can keep retreating back into the safety of Gustave every time the going gets tough, she will never successfully transition into adulthood, which is why bringing Gustave back to life in her ending is so regressive. With that act, she undoes all of this learning and growing. And it is not just herself, but everyone. All of these characters have had to face death and grow into more mature versions of themselves in response. Ciel, who lost her husband and child, Lune, who lost her parents, Gustave, who lost the love of his life. All of that growth is reversed in Maelle's ending. Anyway, from this point forward, her motivations change. Her only goal is killing Painted Renoir in revenge for the murder of Gustave. In the very next scene, back at camp, Maelle explicitly says that she is only continuing to pursue the Paintress because she believes it is the only way to kill Painted Renoir. During their final confrontation, when Verso says they only need to incapacitate him, Maelle declares that no, she is going to kill him. In future scenes, you will see her consumed by anger and hatred. Just look at this expression on her face here. She freaking hates this guy. This scene also includes the introduction of Verso, who also fits into the archetype of the mentor. He is the one who guides Expedition 33 through the continent, he helps her accept Gustave's death, and he even teaches her how to use her powers as a paintress, how to repaint Lune and Ciel. And if you choose his ending, it is his death that forces her to learn how to survive on her own out in the real world. Finally, back at camp, notice the way Maelle turns to Esquier for comfort rather than to Lune or Ciel. She chooses the companionship of this goofy, silly alien creature rather than her fellow humans, further evidence of her alienation. But hey, I get it, I want to hug Esquier too. Geez, remember when I said I was going to go through these scenes as quickly as possible? So much for that, huh? Scene 12, the Forgotten Battlefield. While crossing this bridge, Maelle has a full-on emotional collapse, which grinds the entire expedition to a halt. She is so overwhelmed by her emotions that she is incapable of taking another step forward. Just watch a little of it for yourself and pay attention to how much she is struggling with not just Gustave's death, but death in general.
Holding up. Everywhere we go, just death. Death and more death. Everywhere we go, just death. I don't want to see that anymore.
Look, Maelle.
I thought you would understand. You said you spent your immortality burying the people around you. Doesn't any of this bother you? And you. Gustave's dead. How can you keep going like nothing happened?
That moment when she says, "I just don't want to see that anymore," could sum up the entire story of Clair Obscur. All of these characters are struggling with facing these harsh realities, and when given the option, many of them choose to turn away, to escape into the comfort of fantasy instead. Anyway, this emotional collapse is paired with the physical collapse of the bridge, which drops her into a shadowy abyss filled with carnage and corpses, yet another encounter with death. This is the thematically lowest point in her story, the Crucible moment, a period in which the hero passes through their most intense trial, characterized by extreme suffering and pain. However, enlightenment and transformation often await the hero on the other side of that crucible. This is followed by the funeral scene, in which Maelle is able to say goodbye to Gustave and find some measure of peace. She is able to come to terms with mortality. This is the beginning of maturity. Moving forward, I am going to skip the whole recruitment of Minoko, the trip to Old Lumiere, the Axons, even the battle with the Paintress, as most of this is just a retread of themes we have already discussed. Something important to note is that along with Maelle's growing maturity during this section, there is also a growing sense of confidence and importance. She is the one singled out by the curator with delivering the hearts of the Axon. She is the one tasked with wielding the sword that destroys the chroma barrier, protecting the Paintress. And she is the one who is revealed to possess the power to Gommage both Painted Renoir and the Paintress. With each of these moments, Maelle more and more grows into the role of the hero. After spending her whole life feeling powerless and alone, for the first time she feels like she really matters. When she defeats Painted Renoir, she has achieved her personal goal, and soon after receives self-knowledge as a reward. She is able to complete this layer of the hero's journey and return to Lumiere transformed. She leads an entire army on an assault against her father in order to save the canvas. That girl we met at the beginning of the story who felt lost and powerless has all but vanished, replaced by a very different and much more confident character. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we need to talk about Scene 13, the flashback. This is where it is revealed that Maelle is not Maelle, she is Alicia, the youngest daughter of the Desandra family, who entered the canvas with the goal of helping force her mother out, which she did accomplish, though it took a little longer than she probably expected. This is where the theme of guilt really comes into focus. Her brother Verso, the real one, not the one she met in the canvas, was recently killed in a fire set in their home. This death continues to haunt her nightmares. The dialogue with Clea here makes it clear that Alicia is at least partially responsible for his death. She says, "You are too weak to do anything useful. You would be a liability. The writers used you against us once before. They will not hesitate to use you again." And later she says, "Lest you forget, the only reason those two are in there is because your naivete cost Verso his life." In the background of Claire Obscure's world, there's a violent conflict raging between two groups, the painters and the writers. Reading between the lines, the suggestion here is that the writers tricked Alicia somehow, took advantage of her overly trusting nature to strike at the Desandras, and Verso got caught in the crossfire. But why was Alicia so vulnerable to their deceit? What was the source of her naivete? What really happened here? Well, that is where the theme of loneliness comes back into play. For example, you can examine this wall of framed paintings, and Alicia says that the tiny little canvas in the bottom right, so much smaller and less impressive than all the others, is her own. The only one her mother deemed good enough for the wall. I mentioned in my video on Aline that she seemed like the kind of mother who has very high expectations for her children, and there is evidence here that Alicia was not meeting those expectations. Her paintings are not good enough, and in a family of extremely talented master artists, that probably felt very isolating. Moreover, during Clea's dialogue here in the Endless Tower, she mentions that while she and Verso spent hours going on adventures together inside the canvas, Alicia stayed behind, remaining alone in her room, spending all her time reading books. So even among her siblings, it sounds like she did not fit in. And let's talk more about this apparent interest in literature. This is speculation, but I wonder if Alicia turned to books in the same way that Verso turned to music, or Clea turned to sculpting. All three of them did not feel that painting was a good fit for them, and so they looked for meaning and purpose elsewhere. Maybe Alicia tried to form some sort of connection with the writers to join their community, but instead of befriending her, the writers betrayed her, used her as an unwitting tool to strike at their mortal enemies. Her attempt at making new friends transformed into a deadly nightmare. This is her loss of innocence moment, when an encounter with cruelty, betrayal, or the darker side of human nature strips away her childish sensibilities and forces her to confront the world's harsher truths. And this is the source of her guilt, which becomes the dominant emotion driving her entire story arc. Just listen to what she says to her father in the final confrontation.
After the fire, you wanted me to find new joy in life. And I tried. But I couldn't. Verso died because of me. How do I get from that to joy?
It is her feelings of guilt over her brother's death, just as much as or even more than anything else, that are driving her to choose to remain inside the comforting world of the canvas. And so let's talk more about Scene 14, the final confrontation with Renoir. From the perspective of the coming-of-age story, it is absolutely essential that Maelle wins this battle, not because she is right, not because he is a villain, but because in order to grow up, she has to break free from parental control and stand on her own 2 feet as an independent adult. Of course, this is complicated by the fact that Renoir is trying to save her life here. This is an example of the way the writers of Claire Obscure refuse to tell a simple, straightforward version of the coming-of-age story. Here at the end, everything gets tangled up and twisted on its head. In order to survive on her own, she has to win, but if she wins, she will die. And moreover, in order to grow up, she has to break free from his control, but if she breaks free from control, she will choose to stagnate in a fantasy never land where she will never grow up. The only reason why this whole mess has any chance of getting untangled is because, at the very last moment, Verso refuses to play along. He makes one final attempt to drive her out of the canvas. A cruel choice, but out there, she will have a chance to flourish and thrive in a way she never would have inside the canvas. I mentioned at the beginning of this essay that the coming-of-age story usually begins with the protagonist leaving the safety and familiarity of home behind to venture out into the wider world. Well, over the course of this story, the canvas becomes Maelle's home, and so technically she does not leave home until the very end of the game. This is not the completion of her coming-of-age story, it is the beginning. There has been a lot of talk about whether Clair Obscur should have a sequel and what that sequel might look like. Well, I think there's still a lot of potential in Maelle's character. How will she navigate this dangerous world of painters and writers? Can she find a new community, new purpose, or new meaning? If the writers are willing, there's absolutely space here for a second part to this story. Before I end this video, there are still 2 more scenes I want to discuss, and these are the most troubling moments in her whole story. This is the closest Maelle ever gets to becoming the villain. The first occurs during an optional endgame side quest, after ascending the final Axon, the Reacher, which, as I discussed in my video on Renoir, is his artistic representation of his daughter's potential. If she could set aside her fears and believe in herself, she too could reach for the stars. At the summit, she has her final encounter with her reflection. I mentioned earlier that by embracing her past, Maelle rendered her other self obsolete. Therefore, her passing is a natural conclusion of the narrative. But there is something else happening here too. At this phase of her story, Maelle has fully embraced her identity as a painter and all of the power that comes with it, including the power over life and death. In fact, I think she has become a little too comfortable with it. Verso is absolutely devastated by the Gommage of his sister, the last living member of his family inside the canvas, before he even got a chance to say goodbye. Notice the way Maelle stands over him here, not expressing any comfort, any consolation, any explanation. It is Ciel who rushes forward and attempts to comfort Verso, while he looks up at Maelle in anger, who now seems to tower over him, a visual representation of their new difference in power. I find this scene very uncomfortable, the way she just ignores him and his obvious suffering. At the start of the story, she was portrayed as a character who cared about others, but now it seems as if some of her empathy has withered away, replaced by a newfound sense of importance. To be fair, she and Verso do have an interaction at the camp later, where she defends her choice by saying that this is what Painted Alicia wanted. She was just honoring her other self's wishes. But there is a deep hypocrisy in this justification. At the end of the game, if you choose her ending, Verso makes it clear that he also does not want to live this life anymore, and she does not honor his wishes. She forces him, or at least some version of him, to keep on living with her inside the canvas, which is by far the worst sin she commits in this story. It would be easy to call this a form of selfishness. She is choosing her own emotional needs over his, but I think it is more complicated than that. Maelle is so driven by her guilt over her brother's death, and I think she really wants to absolve herself by giving this other version of him a second chance at a full life, even if he doesn't want it, which sort of parallels the behavior of the 2 Renoirs, who both want to save their child's life even if that child does not want to be saved. And so we reach the end of yet another Clair Obscur character analysis. Maelle is not your typical goody two-shoes video game protagonist. She is flawed, she is lost, lonely, and afraid. At various turns, she becomes consumed by rage, then guilt, then power. She has the potential to become more than she is, to grow beyond her mistakes, but she is incapable of taking those steps on her own. Left to her own devices, she would choose stagnation, and it is easy to understand why. How many of us would be willing to trade a home, a family, a place we feel like we belong, in exchange for what? An uncertain future, potentially even more pain and suffering and confusion? Another character has to force her out of her comfort zone. Once again, it's just a shame that all of those innocent people had to die so that she could complete her personal journey. This was supposed to be a quick cleanup video to close out this series, but that didn't quite work out. And the more I examine Clair Obscur, the more layers I find. This is one of those rare stories that only gets more compelling the more times you experience it. And so I am going to do one more video. Next time, we are going to look at Gustave, the tragic protagonist who gets practically forgotten by his own story.
Dim dim da 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 dim da 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 dim da di dum dim da 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 dim da 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 dim